and I am honored to welcome all of you to this virtual event tonight featuring Mark Dubowitz, Chief Executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. This past Thursday night, a joyful evening of celebration on Mount Meron turned into an unspeakable tragedy. In the truest sense, we are all in mourning. Jewish communities from around the world have been expressing their support and offering their sympathies and prayers. Each of us extend our deepest condolences to the families of those who lost their lives and wish a quick and complete recovery to those who were injured. It's just an awful, awful, awful thing. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Brandeis Baruch, Chaim Weitzman, and Maimonides Societies, which are Jewish Federation's professional societies. They were founded to support and strengthen Jewish life throughout Northeastern New York. All participants tonight are and will remain muted for the course of the program. We will be using the chat box feature to accept all questions for Mark, and questions will be answered during the Q&A portion at the end of the program. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available online. I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Danny Nirenberg. A Cincinnati area native, Danny has decades of following Israeli politics, issues, and news, advocating for Israel, and debunking the sea of misinformation and propaganda aimed at delegitimizing the Jewish state. Danny moved to the Capital Region in 1994 and is a past longtime board member of the Nassau Synagogue. We have Danny to thank this evening for connecting us with Mark Dubowitz and for arranging this fabulous opportunity of hearing his views. Thank you, Danny. The mic is all yours.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Jewish Federation of Northeastern New York, for supporting this, coordinating this, for sponsoring this. I really appreciate it. I think we'll have a very valuable evening as a result. As Mark said, we have Mark Dubowitz with us tonight, a very honored speaker because of his incredible, immense experience on this issue. If you didn't already know, the title of this presentation is Shifting Alliances and Policies to Counter the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Mark is a perfect guest for us to learn as much as we can about this subject. Mark is the chief executive and founder of the organization, as Mark just told us, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, often referred to as FDD. It's a Washington-based nonpartisan policy institute. He's an expert on Iran's nuclear program and global terror and threat network, and is widely recognized as one of the key influencers in shaping policies to counter the threats from the regime in Iran. And just as really evidence of how expert he is on this, the Iranian regime sanctioned Mark and his organization, the FDD, calling them, and I quote, the designing and executing arm of the US administration on Iran policy. These threats from the Iranian regime led to bipartisan condemnation from a lot of people in the government, including administration officials from the Trump, Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations. That's how serious this threat was. So, and according to the New York Times itself, and I quote the New York Times here, Mark Dubowitz's campaign to draw attention to what he saw as the flaws in the Iran nuclear deal has taken its place among the most consequential ever undertaken by a Washington think tank leader. So, and I just want to say on a personal note, with all that testimony to his expertise, I attended one of Mark's presentations back in December that the the North Carolina Voice for Israel and the Federation in North Carolina sponsored. And I was just so impressed by it and so taken by the breadth of his knowledge and the way he presented it, that I'm very, very pleased that he was able to join us here and inform some of our Capital Region members here about his and share his knowledge with us. So really want to just say how pleased I am that he's here. So let me turn it over to Mark right to begin with. I'm hoping he'll tell us just a little bit about his organization, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, what the purpose is, and then we can dig into Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is often referred to as the JCPOA, and hopefully we can all get up to speed on that through Mark. So Mark, go ahead and take it.
Hey, thanks so much, Danny, and really pleased to be with all you folks in Federation. Federation's certainly very close to my heart. My wife for many years has been on women's philanthropy for Greater Washington Federation, and I used to work the phone bank for Federation in Toronto. So very familiar with the incredible work that you all do. And so thank you for all your support for Federation. My organization, FDD, it's a think tank, it's an action tank. Our sort of unofficial mission is that we do damage to the enemies of America, Israel, and other free nations. And it was founded about 20 years ago and sort of conceived of by Jeane Kirkpatrick and Jack Kemp and Chuck Schumer, Frank Lautenberg, a bipartisan group of policymakers and also philanthropists. And it was Jeane Kirkpatrick who actually 2 weeks before 9/11 pulled everybody together and said, I'm very concerned that the terrorism being directed against Israel will one day come to its America's shores, because if people have grievances against Israel, they certainly have grievances against the United States. And we need a new think tank that's focused on this threat. And she was really prescient. And 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened. We all got back together after 9/11 and FDD opened its doors. And since then, we've been very focused on those threats, including the threat from the Islamic Republic in Iran that we're going to talk about tonight, as well as good news, because with these speeches, these events sometimes are depressing when we all talk about the threats and what it means for the Jewish people, what it means for Israel, what it means for America. But there's good news, as you all know, in the region and around the world. So I hope, Danny, we're going to talk about that as well.
Yeah, we will. We certainly will. But I was thinking maybe there's some people who aren't so familiar with JCPOA and what's been going on with Iran, what happened under the Obama administration with the negotiations and the agreement. I thought maybe you could take a few minutes and just catch us up to the point where the administrations are now just to the point where they changed to the Biden administration, just so everybody's up to speed.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, it's a long story, but essentially the United States has had sanctions against Iran for many years, really since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the taking of US hostages. Jimmy Carter put on the first sanctions, and then every administration continued to impose pressure on the Islamic Republic for its support for terrorism, for its taking of hostages, for its causing chaos in the region, and also for its increasingly clandestine nuclear program. And the sanctions on Iran's nuclear program eventually led to negotiations in 2013 between the Obama administration and Iran, which culminated in the 2015 JCPOA. That agreement was in place for a few years, and then President Trump withdrew from that agreement in May 2018, imposed what's called the maximum pressure campaign, using economic pressure, but also working closely with the Israelis to strike at Iran, inside Iran, and in the region. And the Biden administration has now come in and it's committed itself to going back into the JCPOA and lifting many of the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed, and turning from a campaign of maximum pressure to, I guess, what they would call a campaign of maximum diplomacy. Those negotiations to go back into the JCPOA are happening actually right now, this week in Vienna, where the Biden administration has sent its lead negotiator, Rob Malley, to negotiate a return back to the original agreement.
Okay, and what do you see, or what would you say are the strengths and the weaknesses of the agreement as it turned out in 2015?
I think the strengths of the agreement is that, the United States and Iran, substantively for the first time in many years, sat down at the negotiating table. And the United States was joined by its European allies, by the Chinese and Russians, and negotiated a deal which, in the short term, I would say took away some of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but in the medium to long term, provided an agreement that I've called fatally flawed. And I've called it that because many of the restrictions negotiated, the short-term restrictions that prohibited Iran from expanding its nuclear program, would sunset or go away over time. Regardless of what Iran did, whether it cheated or complied with the agreement, the restrictions would go away. And within a matter of 5 to 10 years, Iran could emerge with a nuclear infrastructure, industrial size, near zero nuclear breakout, advanced centrifuge powered, easier clandestine sneak out option, ballistic missiles to carry those warheads, which were not covered in the original agreement, and hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild their economy, immunize themselves from sanctions pressure, and fund the Revolutionary Guards, Hezbollah, Hamas, other terrorist organizations, proxies through the region to build up their regional dominance. So the JCPOA was a decent short-term deal, but in exchange, Iran ends up with patient pathways to nuclear weapons, economic power, and regional dominance.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I'd always heard was the rewards are up front, and before Iran really had to take any action on reducing their path towards nuclear development. And what about the compliance aspect? I mean, there was a lot of questions about how well the IAEA could make sure that Iran was complying with the agreement. There were things that happened after the agreement where Iran claimed that they didn't allow certain places to be inspected, all this sort of thing. What can you tell us more about those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, the administration, the Obama administration negotiated some access to Iran's known sites. Now, of course, these were known because Western intelligence discovered them, not because Iran declared them. But they put in 24/7 remote monitoring. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, weapons inspectors were inside 2 main sites in Natanz and Fordow. And so that was good. It's good to get some insight into what was going on in those facilities. But what happened is the Obama administration originally demanded anywhere, anytime inspections, including inspections on Iranian military sites and Revolutionary Guard sites where they actually housed these enrichment facilities and where they had built clandestine facilities in the past. The Iranians rejected that proposal, and the inspection rights are limited and constrained. And Iran has used those limited rights to deny access to the IAEA to sites where there is suspicion that Iran has maintained undeclared nuclear materials and nuclear facilities in violation both of the JCPOA and Iran's obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then Mossad actually shocked the world in a daring operation, snuck into Iran, seized a massive nuclear archive from Tehran, and drove it out of the country. And therein, we discovered that Iran had a nuclear weapons program with a goal of building initially 5 nuclear weapons. The program was led by a guy named Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and the program was continuing, but in what we call an unstructured way. After 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, the Iranians were smart and realized they could be next. So what they did is they broke their nuclear program into overt and covert elements. On the overt side, they continued to claim that they were building civilian and nuclear program with domestic enrichment and reprocessing, which could also use to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. And on the covert side, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh continued to maintain his teams and do research into nuclear weapons. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, as many of you know, we may not know the name, but you may know the reports, was assassinated reportedly by Israel and was taken out again in a daring operation. But he was very much the fall of Iran's military nuclear program, and the military nuclear archive revealed that the Iranians were deceiving the world about their so-called peaceful intentions.
Yeah, and as far as I can see, they still claim that they're not building, some claims that they're not really after a nuclear weapon. But you mentioned the economic benefits that Iran got from JCPOA, the immediate economic benefits. Can you tell us a little bit about how they used those economic benefits right after some of it was received? I mean, there's reports about how they extended their reach into various places, how they're more and more involved in Yemen, and then sending things over to Saudi Arabia to sabotage Saudi Arabia. Is that part of this whole economic benefit that they got from JCPOA, or?
Well, very much so. I mean, certainly Iran, like every government, has to make these fundamental choices between guns and butter, right? In this case, guns for terrorists and butter for their people. In 2015, right before the agreement was reached, they were facing a major budgetary squeeze as a result of sanctions that President Obama, President Bush, and a bipartisan Congress had imposed. After JCPOA, most of those powerful economic sanctions were lifted. Tens of billions, in fact, hundreds of billions flowed into the coffers of the mullahs. Now they had sufficient funds both for guns and butter. They used some of that money to begin to rebuild their economy. They used a lot of that money to fund the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force and Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and proxies in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, as you said, and really begin to expand their campaign of regional destruction. So, the health ministry got very few benefits. The Revolutionary Guards got double, in some cases, triple-digit increases in their resources. It's safe to say that's exactly what will happen in the next weeks and months when the Biden administration goes back into the JCPOA, lifts all those most powerful sanctions, and flows billions of dollars back into those coffers. Just to give you, Danny, just one data point. I don't want to bore everybody with macroeconomic indicators, but in 2018, the regime in Iran had access to $122 billion of foreign exchange, right? That's for a $400 billion economy. Today, that same regime has access to $4 billion. So they went from $122 billion to $4 billion as a result of the sanctions that the previous administration imposed. They're facing economic crisis, and sadly, like happened in 2013 to 2015, they're on their knees, and just where we're able to put them on their back, we're extending a hand to lift them onto their feet and give them another economic reprieve so that they'll have billions more to fund guns for terrorists and a largesse for the revolutionary elite. It's a safe bet that most Iranians will never enjoy the benefits of that money.
Which takes us really now, that's a great synopsis of what's happened up till now. And I kind of want to go into what you and your organization thinks will happen now with under the Biden, what's already happened basically, and how you see things going from here with the negotiations to get us back into the agreement.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the United States wants to go back into the agreement. President Biden has made that clear. Rob Malley is negotiating a U.S. return. I mean, the only thing that will stop the United States from going back into the agreement is if Iran decides not to go back. I would say there's probably no concession that the Iranians could ask for at this point, where the United States would say no. They've, from what I understand, speaking to folks close to the negotiations, they've already agreed to most Iranian demands. So I think there's really nothing stopping the return to the JCPOA. The real question is, after that return, what is the Biden administration's Iran policy? How likely will that policy be realized? And what are the other players in the region going to do in response to that?
Yeah, because they have to consider the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese everybody has a very different take on what they want out of this agreement. And that actually brings me to another point, which is, what about this arrangement or agreement that we see coming between China and Iran, and how is that going to play into whatever the U.S. interests are involved in this?
Yeah, I mean, many actors that are relevant here. I mean, we tend to focus a lot on the Europeans and the Chinese and Russians because they're actually at the table negotiating the return to the JCPOA. Europeans, the UK, France, and Germany, and the EU itself is committed to go back into that agreement. The Chinese and Russians are playing a double game, as they always do, and one can safely assume that they're negotiating on behalf of Iran. The Chinese in particular are interesting for the reasons you said. So the Chinese and Iranians under the Obama administration began to talk about a massive Sino-Persian deal that would provide hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in Iran. That agreement got shelved during the Trump administration, when that administration made it very clear that they would sanction Chinese banks and Chinese energy companies and Chinese corporates if that deal came to fruition. And what was interesting is that the Chinese backed down. I mean, Chinese oil purchases from Iran dropped from 800,000, 1 million barrels to under 100,000 under maximum pressure. Chinese banks, even those banks that had been processing oil transactions in the past, stopped because those Chinese banks and Chinese energy companies did not want to lose access to global financial and energy markets. So it's proof that U.S. power is effective enough to keep even the Chinese out of Iran. Well, that's changed now, of course, because the Chinese know the Biden administration is going back in. They're lifting the most powerful sanctions. They won't enforce sanctions against Chinese banks and energy companies. And so we heard a number of weeks ago that this big $400 billion deal had been reached between Beijing and Tehran. And the deal will involve massive purchases of Iranian oil by China, significant Chinese investment in Iran's energy sector, automotive sector, industrial sector. And so I think it's certainly going to make it very difficult for the United States in the future to use peaceful economic leverage and sanctions against the Islamic Republic if and when the Islamic Republic breaks free of the JCPOA and begins to expand its nuclear program and other malign activities.
And the thing that interests me in this is that as the negotiations back in 2013 to 2015 were going on, the cry was that we either make this agreement or there's war. I mean, those were the only two options that we were being told, and that's why we had to make this agreement, else we'd have to go to war. And yet, what you're telling us is that these economic sanctions are a peaceful way, a lot of peaceful leverage against the Iranian nuclear plans.
Well, yeah, that's right, Danny. But look at sort of two interesting data points, right? The Trump administration was imposing maximum pressure on Iran, powerful sanctions. The Americans and Israelis cooperated to kill Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most deadly battlefield commander. And yet the Iranians didn't escalate against the Trump administration, and it didn't lead to war. Now you would say, all right, well, that's the United States. We're a superpower. We have a massive military. Iran has shown in the past they don't want to take on the United States military. They know that will end the regime. But let's take the Israeli example. Israel is a country of approximately 9 million people, small, highly effective Air Force and intelligence community. And the Israelis have been pounding the Iranians in Syria, to some extent in Iraq, and certainly inside Iran. There, as I've mentioned earlier, there have been assassinations of the top battlefield commander, the head of their military nuclear program. The Mossad took out the Al-Qaeda's #2 in the streets of Tehran, a guy who was masquerading as a professor. They took him out. And then they also launched quite impressive sabotage operations against Iran's enrichment facility and advanced centrifuge assembly plant. So with the Israelis doing this, a country of 9 million people, what's been the response from Iran? Has it escalated into a massive war between Israel and Iran? It has not. It has not yet. It could. But so far, the Iranians have been backing down in the face of American power. So that false choice, that false dichotomy that was presented in 2015, that it was this deal or war, I think has been undermined by the realities on the ground when the United States and Israel inflicted significant damage on Iran, and Iran backed down. Now, the question is going forward, well, what happens when we empower this regime, we flood it with billions, we give it an industrial-sized nuclear program and patient pathways to nuclear weapons. The Iranians have learned that they can use nuclear extortion to get the United States to surrender at the negotiating table. And at some point, the Israelis are just not going to sit on their hands. I mean, at some point, the Israelis are going to have no choice but to go in and use military strikes to take out Iran's nuclear program. I hope they don't. I hope to God they don't need to. I hope sabotage and covert operations continue to roll back Iran's nuclear program. But I worry that Washington is giving Israel no choice at some point to go in there and launch military strikes. And then we have the war that all of us have tried to avoid through the use of peaceful pressure.
Yeah, and speaking about the sabotage, the recent sabotage of the Natanz facility, you know, the Iranians all downplay the damage done, but do you have any information from from your contacts about really how much damage that did do? And then the Iranians claim they're going to go to 60% enrichment, and what as a result of that, and what the impact is. That real? Is any of that real, or what's the real story with some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's all real. It's real. Certainly, the Israeli operation estimates are that they set back Iran's program at least by 9 months, if not longer. There was also an operation about a year and a half ago where they hit their advanced centrifuge assembly plant, which also reportedly set back operations again by 9 months. You know, the Israeli military strategy, Danny, as you know, has always been kind of mow the grass, right? The Israelis know, you know, given their limited power, they can't land a knockout blow against formidable enemies like Iran. So they mow the grass. They have to go in every couple of years, maybe even more frequently these days, and set back that program. The United States could obliterate Iran's nuclear program with our firepower, but there's no evidence the United States is prepared to do that. On the nuclear escalation side, yeah, I mean, while maximum pressure was being put on Iran, what Iran did do was begin to break free of the restrictions imposed on them under the JCPOA. But remember, those restrictions are restrictions that go away anyway, right? Those are restrictions that sunset over a course of the next few years. And so what Iran is doing is showing the world that the JCPOA was only a temporary agreement, and that there was nothing to prevent Iran from shaking off the restrictions once they sunsetted and beginning to escalate their nuclear program. Now, the question is, since Iran at some point was going to escalate its nuclear program and engage in the nuclear extortion we're seeing them engage in today, do you want to face an Iran that is less powerful or more powerful when they are in that position? And my argument has always been that when we reach that lethal end state, as I've defined it, right, an Iran with money and power and regional leverage and an industrial size near zero nuclear breakout nuclear program, do you want Iran to be weak like they are today, or do you want them to be more powerful like they will be in 5 to 10 years? And I think the argument I've made, the argument the Israelis, the Gulf Arabs have made, a number of folks, both Republicans and Democrats, have made, is you're better off confronting that reality today than confronting that reality in 5, 10 years when the Islamic Republic will be much more powerful, much more dangerous, and the consequences of military action will be much more profound.
Well, just to go back a few years, there was at least talk about that Israel was planning a certain attack under Netanyahu, sort of planning some things in Azerbaijan and getting some military gear together there, but that was leaked by the Obama administration to sort of thwart that and sort of stop the Israelis from having that option. And of course, it seems like the cry back then was the military options sort of off the table anyway. So so it brings up the question for me about leaks that come from, say, other places, because we see that happening even now. Israel most often never acknowledges what they do in sabotage. They usually don't say anything about what they did in Natanz, but now we see leaks happening, and then just recently we saw that conversation leaked between Kerry and John Kerry and Zarif as a potential leak. So is there a lot of danger there? Is there really these leaks going on? And why would the U.S. be betraying Israel if that's true? If there are these leaks, why would the U.S. want to be betraying Israel in that way?
Look, there's no doubt in my mind that leaks were occurring under the Obama administration. Leaks from the White House to reporters were quite rampant in order to try to undercut Israeli military and covert activity. I think actually Israel learned a lesson from that, which is that if Israel continues to follow a policy where they don't acknowledge their operations, they will always be susceptible to White House and other leaks used to undercut their operations. So I think the Israelis decided after that step by step they would begin to do the leaking.
Oh, okay.
I think a number of the operations that have occurred recently that I mentioned on Fakhrizadeh and the Al-Qaeda #2 and Natanz and the centrifuge assembly plant, and a number of other operations, including striking at Iranian ships. My sense is that those leaks are actually coming from the Israelis in a campaign to both send a message to Tehran about Israeli potency and send a message to Washington that they will no longer be handcuffed by the fear that Washington could leak on them, right? Because if they're acknowledging them, then leaks don't matter anymore. They're no longer as effective.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned the Israeli attacks on some Iranian ships, but there have been some reprisals by the Iranians supposedly on Israeli ships as well. You mentioned that they've kind of backed off but there are a few things that they've done to try to show that they will strike back in smaller ways. They're very measured. Is there anything to say about that?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, certainly the Iranians have not, and I don't want to leave folks with the impression they've done nothing. They've obviously done quite a lot. I mean, they were striking at ships under the Trump administration. Obviously, Iraqi Shiite militias backed by Iran were firing missiles at U.S. troops, which actually ultimately led to the U.S. decision to kill Qasem Soleimani. They shot down a U.S. drone, again harassing ships in Hormuz, obviously a critical pathway for the transportation of global oil. They struck at Saudi oil facilities. And with the Houthis have kept up a steady drumbeat of missile attacks on both Saudi economic and civilian infrastructure. They've also struck Israeli ships, and they've tried. I mean, they've certainly tried around the world to target Israeli diplomats. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if they return back to their campaign of targeting Jewish institutions, as they've done in the past around the world, and they try to blow up dissident rallies in Paris. So yeah, they've been busy. So I certainly don't want to give you the impression they haven't been. But given the beating that they've taken from both the United States under Trump and Israel under Netanyahu, their reprisals have been remarkably small in comparison, which is not to say that that's what's coming, because maybe revenge is a dish best served cold. But I think that they've gotten a taste of American and Israeli power, and they understand that, when America and Israel are serious, and particularly when America and Israel are working together, the regime in Iran stands no chance. But of course, that may all change in the next couple of years, and that would be obviously an opportunity for the Iranians to sense American weakness and translate that weakness into both regional gains and attacks against Israel.
And then we mentioned China and the agreement that they made with Iran, but now in the last week or two, we also see that the Russians have agreed to protect Iranian shipping so that they can ship supplies to Syria. Do you know anything you can enlighten us on that score?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting dynamic with the Russians. On one hand, the Russians and Iranians cooperated extensively to keep Assad in power in Syria. The Russians provided the air campaign, and the Iranians provided boots on the ground. That's been a highly successful operation, and as you know, they've kept Assad in power. They've repelled rebel attacks, and it's sort of a mopping up operation right now. So, the Russians still need these ships coming in, supplying Assad with oil. They certainly need ships coming in to supply weapons. So there's still cooperation going on between Russia and Iran. However, having said that, the Israelis and the Russians have been cooperating, or at least they've been deconflicting, given the almost 2,000 Israeli air attacks into Syria against Iranian-backed positions. And so Netanyahu has been to Moscow countless times to talk to Putin. IDF generals and Russian generals have closely deconflicted to make sure that no Israeli Air Force plane fires on or God forbid, at least from the Israeli perspective, kills any Russians. And the Russians, I think, are reaching a point where they want Syria for themselves. I mean, they don't want to divide it up with the Iranians, and the Iranians are very aggressive and playing a long game there. I think the Russians would be happy to see the Iranians out of Syria. I think Assad would be happy to see the Iranians out of Syria. So there is some opportunity for some kind of realignment. I think the Israelis are leveraging that. Remains to be seen whether the Biden administration takes advantage of that.
Okay, well, I'm thinking maybe we can move, sort of segue this into how this whole JCPOA Iranian, the events have made realignments in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors, some of her neighbors. And that's via the Abraham Accords that came up late in the Trump administration. Can you maybe catch us up a bit so everyone's up to speed on the Abraham Accords, what they are, and then maybe we can talk about where you think they will go, and if there are other countries that are going to come into play, and what the situation is with the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, so the Abraham Accords were reached between the United States, Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain as initial signatories. It's an agreement for Israel and those Arab countries to normalize. So it's beyond even a peace agreement. It's a normalization agreement. And you already see on the ground, I mean, it's just unbelievable, Danny, to see the embrace that is occurring right now on all levels between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain. The Trump administration extended the Abraham Accords to include Sudan and Morocco. And we can talk about, other potential candidates for normalization in a second. But the agreement is remarkable. And it's remarkable only because it obviously, how would I put this politely? It contradicts the paradigm that has been so pervasive here in Washington for so many years, that you're never going to get normalization with the Arab world until you get peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And it was only, recently that John Kerry was saying publicly that there was no way. I mean, there was no way the Arabs would ever normalize with Israel without Israeli-Palestinian peace, which was interesting for Kerry to say, because I imagine Kerry was having conversations similar to the ones I was having. I mean, I was in the region. I was talking to Saudis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis, and have been for a number of years. And every time I went there and spoke to senior officials, the highest level officials, all I heard was Iran is the threat. Israel is not. Israel is an important ally in countering the Iranian threat. You Americans are hightailing out of the Middle East and pivoting to Asia. We're going to have to take on the Iranians alone. And we need the IDF, and we need the Mossad, and we need Israel's political clout in Washington and elsewhere. And conversations would go on and on and on for days. And they would never mention the Palestinians until I put up my hand in meetings and said, well, this is all very interesting, but what about the Palestinians? And the response from these Arab leaders was, you know what? Candidly, Mark, we're sick of the Palestinians. We've invested a huge amount of resources. A number of Arab countries have fought bloody wars on behalf of the Palestinians. We're moving on. Our societies are moving on. We've got 70% of our population is under the age of 35. We need to think about an economy without oil. We need access to Israeli tech. We need to move far beyond this. And so, you could sense that there was just no interest in constraining their future and defending their countries against Iran, and holding out for Palestinian-Israeli peace, which is not to say they don't want it, not to say that they're not going to try to work with Israelis and Palestinians to achieve it, but they no longer want it to be held hostage by that paradigm, by that Israeli-Palestinian paradigm that, again, had been such a dominant paradigm here in Washington for decades.
And so how do you think now with the Biden administration, your conclusion that they are really wanting to get back into JCPO, and they will do that, how will that affect the Abraham Accords, or what will their policy be regarding the Abraham Accords, and how will they balance that with getting back into the JCPOA?
Yeah, look, I think that the folks in the Biden administration are smart enough to realize that it was a profound change in the region, and it is absolutely the interest of American national security to build on it. They're kind of hesitant to call it the Abraham Accords because, you know, that was Trump's achievement. So they talk about normalization, which is fine. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, who really cares what it's called? The important thing is to advance it. And my sense from the Biden team is they definitely want to advance it and are working with the Israelis and reaching out to other countries to bring them in. The big question will be Saudi Arabia. No. I think if Trump had been reelected, the Saudis would have joined the Abraham Accords in Trump's second term. Now there's a very different dynamic between Washington and Riyadh. Saudi Arabia is, for reasons I think we all know, considered to be sort of bête noire in Washington. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party considers Saudi Arabia, not Iran, to be the enemy. And Biden has said, you know, we're going to sort of reevaluate the U.S.-Saudi relationship. But to his credit, he hasn't gone as far as some of those in Congress who have been advocating for a break in that relationship. He refused to impose sanctions personally on Mohammed bin Salman for the Khashoggi killing. But there's still a reevaluation of this relationship going on. And at some point, you know, the Saudis may decide that the Abraham Accords are not worth it. And what they really need is great power cover. And they may begin to tilt towards the Russians and the Chinese on the assumption that the United States no longer is interested in a significant presence in the Middle East, is not interested in countering Iranian aggression, and that they need the Chinese and the Russians to defend them. In that case, it will be interesting to see whether they still believe that having Israel as a close ally will be worth it, or whether they'll just continue to work with the Israelis behind the scenes, but not actually take the quite significant risk of embracing them publicly.
That's why I wonder how they might balance this whole rush towards the JCPOA with relations with Saudi Arabia and the Abraham Accords. It seems a bit precarious to say, well, we're going to give up. Let's say they make the concessions that you've kind of hinted they probably would make. How could Saudi Arabia live with those, and how could the Abraham Accords really live with those when really they kind of came about because of Iran's aggression, and they're trying to counter Iran's aggression?
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument, and again, you know, one has to be realistic about this, but there is an argument that the Saudis do continue to assess the importance of Israel in countering Iranian aggression, and that actually continues to incentivize them to move towards normalization with the Israelis, and that it's all the more reason why they need Israeli support, given that the Biden administration is going back into this Iran deal. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, and I want to be fair to the Biden administration, is that the Biden administration's announced Iran policies to go back into the JCPOA and then negotiate a longer, stronger, and broader deal. Right? And that's certainly, at some level, what many of the critics of the JCPOA have argued for many years, which is it's a deeply flawed deal. It needs to be longer. It needs to be stronger. And then there's some debate whether it needs to be broader. In other words, should it cover terrorism and Iran's regional activities?
Ballistic missiles.
Should it address missiles? There's a whole host of non-nuclear malign activities that the regime in Iran is engaged in. So longer, stronger, broader is the announced objective of the Biden administration. Now, it depends whether you think they can get it, right? Some people would say, absolutely, you know, they get the Europeans on side. Perhaps the Russians and Chinese are interested in a longer, stronger, broader deal. They will then, with that political alliance, make it clear to the Iranians that the Iranians need to agree to more years on the sunsets, or better inspection rights, or restrictions on advanced centrifuge deployment, or restrictions on the range and potency of ballistic missiles. It's possible. I mean, I'm skeptical, because I think once you lift your most powerful leverage and you flow hundreds of billions of dollars back into the coffers of the regime, I'm a bit hard pressed to see why Iran would want to negotiate a new agreement. Now, of course, there are many, many, many more concessions the United States could give Iran. So it's entirely possible that a new agreement comes with even more significant concessions. I'm worried that that would lead to an agreement that may be worse than the 2015 agreement. But I'm also, I also think that this administration is much more politically adept than the Obama administration in terms of political communications. And I actually think the strategy is to go back into the JCPOA, hold out this longer, stronger, broader deal as an objective, but ultimately an objective which is a mirage. Sort of keep thirsty pilgrims in the desert moving forward, believing that they're finally going to reach a water well, but ultimately take the Iran issue, put it on the back burner, and move on. Because, again, to be fair to President Biden, he's got a lot of other issues on his plate, both domestic and foreign policy. And it is a very common Washington phenomenon on both sides of the aisle to kick the can down the road. And so maybe the plan is kick the can down the road, either to a Biden second term or to a Republican term, and move on to countering the Chinese, the Russians, and obviously dealing with all of our significant domestic challenges.
Okay, and just one final thing. Do you think that do you think that, so we don't leave out the Palestinians completely out of this conversation. Do you think there's some threshold at which they'll sort of come on board with and accept the Abraham Accords, because they've totally rejected them for obvious reasons up till now? Do you see that if the Accords get strong enough and enough nations join, that they would see that there's just no sense in resisting that anymore?
I think that's the hope. It's certainly the hope of the Arab leaders who are coming into the Accords. I'm again doubtful with this leadership. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas is on the 15th year of his 4-year term. He just suspended elections. He's blaming the Israelis, but we all know he suspended elections because he's afraid that Hamas will win them. So you can imagine, and one could hope for a far-sighted Palestinian leader who says, what are we doing? I mean, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, the Sudanese, perhaps the Saudis, the Indonesians. I mean, the list could go on. And you could see this wave of normalization that continues to crash over the Middle East, bringing prosperity and stability to all these Arab countries. And at some point, these Arab leaders say to the Palestinians, it's enough. It's enough. It's enough with the intransigence. It's enough with the incitement. It's enough with the firing of missiles and the launching of terrorist attacks. At the end of the day, get on board. And you also hope that there will be enough grassroots pressure in the Palestinian territories to do the exact same. I mean, I know right now, there's a number of deals that are getting done between Israel and the UAE, Israeli companies who are opening up markets in the Arab world, who are discovering that Israeli Arabs are really well positioned to hire for business development or investor relations because they speak Arabic and they know the Arab culture. And even some companies that I'm aware of that are hiring Palestinians on the West Bank as coders or as business development professionals or sales support professionals. I mean, you could see Israeli tech, Israeli venture capital combined with Emirati and Saudi and other Arab countries bringing along Palestinians and perhaps providing them with jobs and more prosperity and more hope, such that you have a number of Palestinians who say to the Arab leaders or say to Hamas, look, enough. Every time you commit violence, fire missiles, or launch terrorist attacks, you're ruining our economy. You're ruining our prosperity. Look, one can hope. We certainly haven't seen much reason to be hopeful over many years when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian issues. But I do think this normalization wave is profound. I believe the Biden administration will continue it and leverage it. And I think ultimately it could, Danny, help bring the Palestinians around to realize that normalization really is the only way.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Now, I think we're sort of winding down now. I'm ready to ask some of the questions that have been put up on the chat board. So one of them here is, what's the rationale from the Biden administration as to why they would lighten the sanctions?
Well, their rationale is that Iran has made it clear. Iran is not going back into the JCPOA, not going back into compliance, not going to de-escalate their nuclear program unless they get, quote unquote, the benefits promised under the JCPOA. And so the Biden administration's belief is that Iran will not move back into compliance without significant economic benefits. Now, the problem, of course, is that essentially concedes your leverage right at the beginning. And the Biden administration is not only talking about lifting nuclear sanctions, they're talking about lifting sanctions on terrorism and missile proliferation on the Revolutionary Guards. I mean, they're talking about lifting the most powerful sanctions on entities that are linked to the Revolutionary Guards, that are supporting terrorism, and that are developing Iran's missile program. And of course, the problem with that is that, Secretary Blinken promised at his Senate Foreign Relations Committee confirmation hearing that he wouldn't do that. But it appears that they are. And so I think there's going to be quite a tussle coming up with the US Congress on this. And one thing we haven't talked about, Danny, I mean, I'm a former private sector guy. I spent a lot of time in venture capital and high tech. And I always think of this issue not through the prism of politics and politicians, but through the prism of markets. How will thousands of CEOs, chief legal officers, chief risk officers, boards of directors respond to President Biden's decision to lift sanctions on terrorism and the IRGC and missile proliferation when everybody knows that Iran is continuing those malign and destructive activities? And Republicans who understand this are flooding the zone with letters and bills and resolutions, making it clear to these companies that when Republicans take back power, whether it's in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, whatever they may be, or longer, they will reimpose the sanctions. They will withdraw from the JCPOA. And those companies that have gone back into Iran are going to be first on the target list. So there's going to be an interesting dynamic between what happens in Washington and Vienna and what happens in the markets. And that's something I'm watching.
That's an interesting thing to keep track of. I hadn't really considered that part of it. Another question. There were some interesting allegations related to former Secretary of State Kerry this past week. It appears that you aren't as fearful as some about what the Biden team might do. It's not really a question, it's a statement, but I kind of hear a question somewhere in there.
No, I'm quite fearful. If I haven't communicated my fear, that I've done a poor job in the past hour. No, I'm very fearful that they're going to go back into the agreement and flow hundreds of billions of dollars back to the mullahs, and the mullahs are going to use that money to escalate their nuclear program, missile program, regional destruction. So yeah, no, I'm very concerned. The allegations against Kerry are fascinating. So just to sort of bring people quickly up to speed, Javad Zarif, who's the Iranian foreign minister, has been the lead negotiator on the JCPOA, was sitting down for an interview to talk about his record, the record of the Rouhani government, the nuclear negotiations. And in that sit down, Zarif was quoted as saying that he was told by Kerry that Israel had launched 200 strikes against Iranian positions, Iranian-backed positions in Syria, and that he was shocked to learn that. Now that's very, very interesting, because what John Kerry said in defense and what the State Department has said in his defense is, no. I mean, everybody knew at the time that the Israelis were striking these Iran-backed positions in Syria. So what Kerry told Zarif was public. You could have read it in the New York Times. So that's interesting. So either Zarif is lying about the fact that he was shocked to learn this information, or John Kerry's not telling the truth about the timing of the revelations.
Well, John Kerry actually said he never said those things. That was the response I read.
Yeah, he either never said these things or he said them once they were public. So it's not clear. I mean, Zarif, let me, in defense of John Kerry, there's nobody more mendacious than Javad Zarif. I mean, that guy lies like we breathe. So it's entirely possible that he was lying. Now, the other revelations in that audio file, which also was leaked, and we don't know who it was leaked by, Zarif was very critical of Soleimani. He was very critical of Putin and the Revolutionary Guards. I mean, he said things that got him into a lot of hot water with the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards. And in fact, the Supreme Leader just today, without naming him, but by alluding to him, blasted Zarif for the statements that he made. So, it's entirely possible that Zarif was maybe telling the truth for the first time in his life. It's entirely possible that he didn't think that audio clip would be leaked, because, I mean, it's caused some serious political difficulties for him now that it has. And this was kind of a, politician talking about his legacy for the historical record, and that, in fact, what he said was accurate. I know that Republicans on the Hill are quite worked up about this, and I think there'll be some attempt to try to get to the truth of this. it would be quite shocking if Secretary Kerry was leaking confidential information that the Israelis had provided the White House to Javad Zarif before that information ever became public, and Israelis were acknowledging it. So we'll have to see the timeline. We'll have to see what any of these investigations yield.
Okay. And then there's a question, is the killing of Soleimani a net positive or a net negative?
So let's go back to Zarif. I mean, Zarif said in that audio clip that the killing of Soleimani was akin to the United States taking out a major Iranian city. That's how he put it. You know, there's no doubt that killing Soleimani was hugely consequential. I mean, Soleimani, to the extent that anyone is irreplaceable, and you know, one could argue about that, he was the irreplaceable man. I mean, he was a highly experienced, highly potent, very strategic battlefield commander. He had extensive relationships in the Middle East, in places like Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere in Lebanon, that are very difficult to replace. And you've seen the difficulties that the Iranians have had replacing Soleimani. It was quite, look, on the day that we're celebrating the killing of Osama bin Laden 10 years ago, where that killing was, the reaction to that killing was bipartisan support, celebration, and accolades for Barack Obama, all of which were well-deserved. It was a little concerning for those of us who had followed Soleimani's life, who knew that he had thousands of Americans, their blood on his hands, and not to mention thousands of Israelis. It was a little disconcerting when people in this town got up and criticized the previous administration for taking out Soleimani. One would have hoped there would have been the same chorus of bipartisan support for removing one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world who had killed and maimed thousands of Americans. But such is Washington and our political life.
Okay, and this is probably our last one, maybe another one, but regarding the JCPOA deal, is it true that Iran received plane loads of gold bullion as part of the return of the monies impounded by the US since 1979?
Yeah, Iran received $100 billion in cash that was locked up in these escrow accounts around the world. Iran also received $1.7 billion in cash that was flown to the Iranians on pallets. There was some, I don't remember exactly about the gold issue, specifically with the 2015 deal, but there was a massive Iranian-Turkish sanctions-busting scheme involving gold to the tune of $20 billion that my organization first revealed and has led to the prosecution of a major Turkish bank and Turkish executive. And, you know, we can have a whole discussion about what did the Obama administration know? You know, why did they enforce sanctions against that? Were they using that $20 billion to incentivize the Iranians back in 2013 to come to the table and negotiate the interim agreement, the joint plan of action that led to the eventual 2015 agreement? That's for probably a whole other seminar. But there's no doubt that the Obama administration and the Biden administration believe, and one could argue with it or not, that returning billions of dollars, whether in cash or gold, is important to incentivize Iran to constrain its nuclear activities.
Okay, one last final one. Returning to the Abraham Accords, do you see any way that those might end up turning against Israel if new regimes take over the nations, or other circumstances take hold, say in the UAE or in Bahrain, and it becomes also another hostile nation after they've received a lot of, you know, technology from Israel and so forth? Do you see foresee that that's a possibility, and what?
It's certainly a risk. I mean, I had extensive conversations with the Gulf Arabs about this when they were lobbying for the F-35, right? America's advanced fighter jet. I mean, there are two examples, cautionary tales of exactly that, Danny. The first is Iran, when the United States, by the way, and Israel, sold advanced weaponry to the Shah, and he was toppled by Khomeini and the revolutionaries who got their hands on our advanced weaponry. And the second cautionary tale, more recent, is Turkey. I mean, Turkey was actually a part of the F-35 program, member of NATO, has gotten sophisticated US military equipment for years. And then Recep Erdogan took over a decade ago, and he turned Turkey from a pro-Western, pro-Israel, secular NATO ally into increasingly a rather troublesome Islamist state. The good news is Congress, on a bipartisan basis, bucked President Trump and passed overwhelmingly legislation to kick Turkey out of the F-35 program, so that, thank God, so far, the Turks are not going to get the F-35, and we don't have the possibility of Turkish and Israeli pilots in dogfights over the Mediterranean, both flying F-35s. So 2 cautionary tales of what happens when governments and regimes change. And that, obviously that's a possibility in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia. I'm a little less concerned about the UAE. I think it's a very stable government, but it's entirely possible in other countries in the region that circumstances changed and you get another Shah of Iran turning into the supreme leader, or the secular Turks turning into Erdogan.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask some more of the questions, but I think our time is up. So I just really want to thank you for being here with us today, Mark. I mean, I've certainly learned a lot. I have a feeling that everybody here has really gained a real understanding of the global nature of this issue. It's not just a regional issue. It's not just between Israelis and Arabs. It's not just a Middle East issue, but it really could affect overall global relations for a long time. So I really want to thank you for shedding all this light on it.
No, my pleasure. And I think my message to all you folks, because I know how much you care about this issue, you care about America, about Israel, is, when you're reaching out to members of Congress, when you're having these discussions, I mean, nobody wants to see the bitter partisan fight that erupted in 2015. And there's every reason why the United States and Israel should be closely coordinating, playing good cop, bad cop, leveraging Israeli capabilities, and moving towards a deal that will permanently cut off Iranian pathways to nuclear weapons and roll back Iran's aggressive behavior in the region. I think Americans and Israelis share that objective. Democrats and Republicans share that objective. I think there's a real opportunity to, kind of march divided and strike united and be well coordinated, because God knows the Iranians are well coordinated in how they operate against us, between the supreme leader and Zarif, even though they've had a brief falling out. They've well coordinated, and they've run circles around the negotiators in that good cop, bad cop routine. We need to do the same thing as Republicans and Democrats, as Americans and Israelis, as Israelis, Americans, and Gulf Arabs. We have a real opportunity. The Islamic Republic is not 10 feet tall. The Israelis have demonstrated that, and we can roll back their nuclear program, and we can roll back their regional influence, and we can avoid war, and we can use peaceful instruments of leverage to bring down the Islamic Republic and consign it to the ash heap of history, as Ronald Reagan did to a much more powerful adversary in the 1980s.
I would just add their military coordination is pretty amazing with their proxies like Hezbollah and all over the world. So that's another way in which they seem to be excellently coordinated.
Exactly right.
Okay, should I turn it back over to you, Mark?
I think I am back up. Thank you again, Danny and Mark. We appreciate everyone joining us for this evening. Please keep an eye on your inboxes and social media for upcoming information on a special program for Yom Yerushalayim and our Federation annual meeting on June the 10th. Be well, stay safe, and to all, good night.
Bye, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Mark.